Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Great. Today, we're diving into a document that's been making some waves.
Oh, I know the one you're talking about.
Yeah.
It's this 121-page behemoth called US Policy Adjustment Expectations 2025.
That's the one. It's basically a potential roadmap for a second Trump administration, and let me tell you, it's a doozy.
You can say that again. It reads like, well, a blueprint for some really big changes in American politics, like some really serious shifts.
Exactly. Now, I know this might sound exciting or maybe a bit unnerving. It all depends on your perspective. But I think regardless of where you stand politically, it offers a pretty fascinating glimpse into what could be on the horizon, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's a serious attempt to lay out like a concrete policy agenda. It touches on everything: trade, immigration, healthcare, education, you name it, it's all in there.
It's all in there. Overhauling government agencies, a hard line on China, a big emphasis on returning power to the states.
Yeah, they really want to shake things up.
Yeah, they do. So buckle up. We're about to take a deep dive into this document and explore what it could mean for you and the future of the country.
Right. And I think one of the first things that jumps out is the document starts with this analogy. They're comparing the US administration to like a massive cargo ship.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
And they argue that trying to make, these abrupt changes is like trying to turn that ship on a dime. They're saying it's just not effective.
So are they saying lasting change takes time? Like strategic planning and careful execution?
Exactly. They highlight how superficial changes, like even some of the ones made to immigration policy in the first Trump administration, yeah, they might impact individuals, but they don't really create those lasting systemic shifts. And this time, they're aiming for a much, much deeper transformation.
A deeper transformation. Let's talk about those deeper transformations. One of the biggest proposed changes is this the shift in immigration policy, right? Moving away from the current family-based system and towards a merit-based point system.
Yes. Similar to what you see in like Canada or Australia. It's a big departure. And it raises the question, could such a drastic shift even happen in the current political climate? Like, is it even possible?
That's a big question, and probably one for another time. But the document goes on. It even details how the White House itself would function, like from the chief of staff's role down to specific offices, like the Office of White House Counsel. It's like someone took a political organizational chart and put it on steroids.
It is. What really stands out to me is the emphasis on these policy councils, the National Security Council, National Economic Council, Domestic Policy Council. They're the ones coordinating the president's agenda.
So it sounds like they're proposing a really centralized approach to policy, right? Like for both development and implementation.
Exactly. Very centralized. And the changes aren't limited to the White House.
Oh, no. Not even close.
They dive into specific departments like the Department of Commerce, which, according to them, has become bloated and inefficient.
Right. And they have some ideas about how to fix that.
They do. They propose merging the International Trade Administration with parts of the Bureau of Industry and Security, as well as the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative.
Wow. A pretty big shakeup.
Definitely. And there's more. They also want to, get this, bring back political appointees to key positions, and potentially even break up some large entities like NOAA.
NOAA.
The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
Right. NOAA. For those who don't recognize the acronym.
Right. So it's pretty clear they want a leaner government, more politically driven, across the board. It's like taking Drain the Swamp to a whole new level.
Drain the Swamp 2.0.
Exactly. And speaking of draining the swamp, they don't stop there. The Treasury Department gets its own makeover, too. A heavy focus on fiscal responsibility, reducing the national debt, and wait for it, opposing global tax cartels.
Opposing global tax cartels. Now that's a headline.
Right. And they get pretty specific, too. The document proposes, for instance, a two-rate individual tax system and a reduction in the corporate income tax rate.
That's me, right?
Very. It definitely aligns with that emphasis on promoting economic growth.
Well,
and making U.S. businesses more competitive on the world stage.
America first, right?
Exactly.
Now, what about the Small Business Administration? Are they going to dismantle that, too?
Not quite. But they do want to streamline it. They're proposing to focus on, those congressionally authorized programs, eliminating things like direct lending, and bolstering the Office of Advocacy, to protect small businesses from what they see as overregulation.
Okay, so less government involvement in small business lending. But do they plan to do anything about all those fraudulent COVID-19 loans?
They do mention holding those who, received fraudulent loans accountable. And they also want to make sure that faith-based organizations are treated fairly in those SPA programs. It's kind of a mixed bag of reforms there.
A mixed bag. Okay. Next up, the Export-Import Bank.
EXIM.
XM, yeah, remember all the controversy around that one?
Huh.
This document argues for its complete abolition, calling it, and I quote, corporate welfare, that, and again I quote, primarily benefits large companies while distorting the market and putting taxpayers at risk.
Strong words.
Strong words indeed. So what do they propose to do with those funds instead?
Well, they suggest redirecting them towards programs that, in their view, genuinely support small businesses. Programs that promote, as they call it, organic economic growth. It's a move that, would definitely spark some debate, especially considering the counter-argument that XM is necessary, to counter China's pretty aggressive export credit activities.
Right, because China's doing the same thing. Okay, speaking of China, it sounds like they're taking a hard line on trade policy overall, right? They're advocating for this reciprocal trade approach, basically making sure other countries aren't taking advantage of the U.S.
Yes. The document explicitly calls for, countering China's economic aggression, reducing the U.S. trade deficit, bringing manufacturing jobs back home. It's very America first when it comes to trade.
It is. And to achieve that, they suggest pushing for things like the U.S. Reciprocal Trade Act, implementing tariffs when necessary, and encouraging companies to bring their production back to the U.S., through various incentives.
It's a pretty bold strategy. It remains to be seen how feasible it would actually be to implement it, though, especially given, the complex global supply chains that exist today.
Global supply chains.
Right.
Right. Now, I know some of our listeners are probably wondering where Kenya fits into all of this. While the document doesn't specifically mention, U.S.-Kenya trade relations, it does give some insights into how a potential second Trump administration might approach trade with African nations more broadly.
Yeah, and that emphasis on reciprocal trade agreements, reducing the U.S. trade deficit, countering China's influence, all of that could have a significant impact on trade flows between the two countries.
Right. They also hint at strengthening alliances with countries that share U.S. interests. So, depending on how the relationship with Kenya evolves, it could either be a case of greater cooperation or maybe even potentially trade friction.
Yeah, it's hard to say for sure.
Yeah, it is. It's a reminder that trade policy can be a really powerful tool in shaping international relations.
Absolutely.
And while the document doesn't explicitly mention AGOA,
The African Growth and Opportunity Act.
right, their general approach to Africa does suggest a bit of a shift in focus.
Yeah. They seem to be advocating for less aid and more emphasis on fostering, free market systems, building coalitions with nations that are cooperative, and, of course, countering that growing influence of China on the continent.
So moving away from those traditional aid models and towards more strategic economic partnerships.
Exactly. It's a theme we see repeated throughout the document, actually, this move towards self-reliance, both domestically and in terms of U.S. foreign policy.
Self-reliance. Got it. Now get ready for this. We're about to dive into the proposed changes to USAID. Oh, USAID.
The United States Agency for International Development.
Right.
Hold on tight. They're calling for a significant scaling back of USAID's global footprint, with a return to its pre-COVID-19 budget levels, and a strong focus on aligning USAID with, U.S. foreign policy priorities. So what does that mean in terms of actual programs? What are they planning to cut?
One of the big things is they want to dismantle what they call USAID's DEI apparatus.
DEI apparatus.
Yeah, that refers to, those programs focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're also proposing to just get rid of DEI requirements from, contracts and grants altogether.
So that's a pretty significant shift away from the Biden administration's emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion in those development programs.
Definitely.
So what will they focus on instead?
Well, they want to refocus those gender equality efforts on things like protecting women, children, and families. They also plan to reinstate that protecting life and global health assistance policy.
Right.
And champion religious freedom as a central tenet of development work. So it sounds like they're pushing for a more conservative approach to foreign aid, one that prioritizes, traditional values and reflects a particular worldview.
Yeah, very much so.
Okay. And in terms of how they're going to actually do all this, they propose things like streamlining procurement processes, increasing awards to, local and faith-based partners, and reducing that reliance on those large U.S.-based implementers.
Right, shaking things up again.
Shaking things up. It's a pretty radical departure from the current model. And speaking of radical departures, Get ready for this. They want to dismantle the Department of Homeland Security.
Whoa, DHS.
DHS. They argue that DHS, created in the wake of 9/11, has become this bureaucratic behemoth.
Right.
And their proposal is to break it up. Just reassign its various components to other departments.
So, like, what happens to CBP, ICE, and USCIS?
Well, Customs and Border Protection, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, they'd all be combined into a, standalone border and immigration agency. And get this, they want to privatize the TSA.
TSA. Wow.
Yeah. They also call for an end to T and U visas.
Those are the visas given to, like, victims of human trafficking and other crimes, right? The ones who assist law enforcement?
Exactly. And they want clear guidance on, detention and bond for undocumented immigrants, stricter vetting in the student and exchange visitor program. They're not holding back when it comes to immigration.
Nope. It's like a continuation of that hardline approach we saw during the first Trump administration. But this time they're aiming for more, systemic and lasting changes.
Systemic and lasting changes. Got it. And what about those seeking, work authorization in the U.S.? Any changes there?
Oh, yeah. They propose a major overhaul of the work authorization process, pushing for this merit-based system that really favors, highly skilled professionals. And they want to reform that H-1B program to make sure it's attracting the best and brightest, as they put it.
So a shift toward prioritizing skills and expertise over, say, family ties or humanitarian considerations.
That seems to be the direction. And get this, they want to make E-Verify mandatory for all employers.
Wow. That would be a big shift in how employment eligibility is verified in the U.S.
Definitely.
And what about asylum seekers? Any changes to that process?
They want to, raise the bar for credible fear claims, eliminate what they call asylum abuse, and end the widespread use of parole.
It sounds like a pretty multifaceted approach to immigration.
It is. And if implemented, it would really reshape the legal landscape for immigrants and asylum seekers in the U.S.
Reshape the landscape.
Yeah.
Next up, we're heading to Foggy Bottom, to the State Department, which is also in for a shakeup. What have they got planned for diplomats and foreign policy?
Well, they're proposing a pretty significant reorganization, streamlining operations, placing political appointees in key positions. All of this, of course, to ensure alignment with the president's foreign policy agenda.
So fewer career diplomats and more political appointees. What are some of the specific policy changes they're pushing for?
Well, for one, they want to just freeze the implementation of unratified treaties and international agreements. They also want to prioritize changes to, visa policies and refugee admissions, and adopt a more critical approach to international organizations in general.
It sounds like they want to take back control, assert greater control over U.S. foreign policy and reduce the influence of what they perceive as these unaccountable international bodies.
Yes, very much so.
So what does this mean for specific organizations like the OECD?
The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development.
Right.
Well, while they don't specifically name the OECD, they do suggest that a second Trump administration would critically assess, the role of all international organizations and, withdraw support from those deemed ineffective or not aligned with U.S. interests.
It's a pragmatic approach to international engagement, but it could also strain relationships with, some long-standing allies.
Yeah, potentially.
Are there any specific countries or regions they highlight in this section? They do hint at stronger support for Taiwan.
No.
As a democratic ally in the face of Chinese aggression.
A move that would likely further escalate tensions between the U.S. and China. And what about NATO? What's their vision for that alliance?
They want to see a more assertive stance, particularly in the Arctic region, where they argue that NATO needs to counter Russian influence more effectively.
So a more hawkish approach to dealing with Russia. Are they planning to, increase U.S. military commitments to NATO?
Actually, no. They want NATO members to contribute more to defense spending, exceeding that 2% of GDP target set in the Wales Pledge.
So they're looking for a NATO that's more focused on, hard power and less reliant on U.S. contributions.
Exactly.
It's a vision that might not sit well with all NATO members, particularly those who, favor a more collaborative and diplomatic approach to those security challenges.
Yeah, it's a pretty different vision.
Now, get ready for this. They want to overhaul the U.S. intelligence community, and they're not holding back. What kind of changes are we talking about here?
Well, they want to, empower the intelligence community.
Yeah.
To be able to anticipate and thwart adversaries, But they're also concerned about politicization and the potential for, for intelligence to be used for partisan purposes.
That's a tricky balance. How do they propose to achieve both of those objectives at the same time?
Well, they propose a whole series of reforms, really. Things aimed at strengthening the DNI's authority,
Yeah.
the Director of National Intelligence.
Ah, right.
They also want to reform the CIA, prevent abuses of power, and address, that emerging threat from, well, you guessed it, China.
So China is still front and center in their thinking. What are some of the specific actions they propose to counter China's intelligence activities?
One specific proposal is the establishment of a dedicated China mission center.
Wow, a China mission center.
Yeah, that's what they're calling for. They also want to see, increased intelligence sharing with allies in the Asia Pacific and a significant increase in the intelligence budget dedicated to China.
It's clear that they see China as, well, as the primary challenge facing the U.S. in the 21st century. And they're not shying away from confronting it head on.
Nope, not at all.
Now, some of our listeners are probably thinking about, the implications for personal privacy and civil liberties. Do they address those concerns?
They do. They propose reforms to FISA.
FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act.
Exactly. And these reforms are aimed at, preventing partisan abuses and ensuring accountability.
Okay, good. Good. So what are some of the specific reforms they're suggesting?
Well, they want stricter penalties for, intelligence leaks, tighter controls on surveillance activities, and a pretty clear prohibition on monitoring so-called domestic disinformation.
It's a complex area,
Yeah.
and their proposed changes would likely, spark some pretty fierce debate about that balance between national security and civil liberties.
Oh, absolutely.
It raises those big questions, right, about how to make sure that intelligence agencies are used effectively to protect the nation while also, respecting the rights of citizens.
A classic dilemma.
A classic dilemma, yeah. Now, let's turn our attention to the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC. What's in store for them?
They're envisioning a more conservative approach to antitrust enforcement, focusing more on the impact of market concentration on, consumers and democratic institutions.
So less focus on breaking up those big tech companies and more on protecting consumers and, ensuring a fair marketplace.
That seems to be the gist, yeah. And they also propose investigating the use of, ESG and DEI practices.
As in?
ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance factors. And DEI, as we talked about earlier, stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah.
They're concerned that these practices, while well-intentioned, could be used to stifle competition.
Interesting. So they're saying that those good intentions could have unintended consequences.
Right. And they also want to make protecting children online a key priority for the FTC, with the agency, taking a much more active role in regulating platforms and advertising practices that target kids.
Yeah, that's definitely an area that's getting more and more attention. And it'll be interesting to see how they balance, the need for regulation with concerns about free speech and innovation.
Right. It's a tough one.
It is. What else?
Well, they also want to see more cooperation between, the FTC and state attorneys general. Potentially empowering states to play a more active role in antitrust enforcement.
So it's a move that could lead to a more a fragmented regulatory landscape, but also potentially more tailored solutions to, local market dynamics.
Yeah, it's a trade-off.
It is. And now, hold on to your hats, folks, because we're diving into the proposed changes for the Department of Health and Human Services.
HHS. Well, buckle up.
This section of the document is, it's a whirlwind of proposals, touching on some really, really contentious issues.
Oh, yeah.
Starting with abortion. What's their stance?
They want to see HHS programs align with their pro-life stance, which means, things like prohibiting funding for abortion travel.
Right.
And Planned Parenthood.
That's a clear signal they're planning to make abortion a central issue in their healthcare policy agenda. What about other aspects of healthcare, like insurance or Medicare? Any proposed changes there?
Well, they want to promote what they call patient-centered, market-based healthcare reforms. Reduce those regulatory burdens on doctors, reform the insurance system to increase transparency and reduce what they call overconsumption.
So more free market principles in healthcare. What about Medicare and Medicaid? Any changes planned for those programs?
They want to see changes that give patients more control over their healthcare decisions and encourage, innovation and efficiency. It's a pretty comprehensive approach to healthcare reform that reflects, a deeply conservative ideology.
It does. And are they just focused on domestic health policy, or are there plans for global health initiatives as well?
They definitely want to prepare for the next, health emergency. They're proposing to restructure the federal public health apparatus and limit the power of, as they call them, public health bureaucrats.
That sounds like a direct response to the COVID-19 pandemic, doesn't it? And all those unprecedented measures taken by the federal government. Are there any specific agencies they, target for reform?
Oh, yeah. They're especially critical of the CDC.
The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
Right. And they propose actually splitting it into two separate entities, one for data collection and another for public health recommendations.
Splitting the CDC, that's a pretty radical proposal. What's the reasoning behind that?
Well, they argue it's to improve accountability and, prevent what they see as overreach. They also want to ban the CDC from accepting funding from, the pharmaceutical industry through that CDC foundation, which is a big move.
It definitely suggests a deep distrust of both the CDC and the pharmaceutical industry, and raises some questions about how they would address, public health crises in the absence of that kind of close collaboration.
Yeah, for sure.
What about the FDA? Any plans for them?
Oh, they have a whole list of proposals addressing things like, drug shortages, streamlining the approval process for new drugs and treatments, and prohibiting practices that, delay the entry of generic drugs into the market.
So it's a mix of pro-market reforms and consumer protection measures aimed at balancing the interests of, patients, pharmaceutical companies, and taxpayers.
Right. Trying to strike a balance.
What about social programs like TNF?
Temporary assistance for needy families.
Right. Any changes there?
They want to see greater transparency and accountability in TNF and other welfare programs, promote adoption reform, protect faith-based adoption agencies. It's a focus on, reducing government spending and promoting those traditional values.
Okay, so less government, more traditional values. Sounds familiar.
Very much so. And they also propose moving the Office of Refugee Resettlement to the Department of Homeland Security.
Really? That would be a big shift in how refugee resettlement is handled in the U.S.
It would. And it reflects, their broader focus on border security and immigration enforcement.
Right, bringing it all together under one roof.
Exactly. And, there's one more thing. They want to restrict HHS's ability to declare those indefinite public health emergencies, like what we saw with COVID-19.
So they're basically saying enough is enough.
Pretty much. It's a sign of their deep skepticism towards government intervention in public health, and raises questions about how they would actually respond to, future pandemics or other health crises.
Yeah, that's a big question mark. Now, brace yourselves, because we're about to enter the world of education reform. And they're not messing around.
Oh, no. They're going for it.
They are. This section is packed with these bold proposals that aim to, completely reshape the U.S. education system.
Top to bottom.
Top to bottom, exactly. They're calling for a return to state and local control, advocating for a really drastic reduction in the federal Department of Education's role.
Right, they want to shrink it down.
Shrink it down. They also want to empower families, through those education savings accounts, give parents more choice in how their children are educated.
School choice.
School choice. And they're pushing for big changes to federal student aid programs, right?
Oh, yeah. They want to treat taxpayers as, investors.
Mm-hmm.
And hold borrowers accountable for, actually repaying their loans.
So less government involvement in education. More power to parents and students. It's that market-driven approach to education again, right? Prioritizing individual choice and fiscal responsibility.
Exactly. That's the through line. And they also want to see more transparency and accountability in, how federal education funds are actually spent, making sure that taxpayers are getting their money's worth.
Again, that theme runs throughout the entire document, right? This desire to shrink the size and scope of the federal government, empower individuals and states to make their own decisions.
It's a consistent theme, yeah.
Now, are they just focused on K through 12, or do they have plans for higher education as well?
Oh, they have plans. They're proposing some significant reforms to higher ed, overhauling those accreditation requirements, privatizing student lending programs, eliminating what they see as redundant loan programs. It's a major shakeup of the higher education landscape.
A major shakeup, got it.
Yeah.
Any other specific issues they address in this section?
They also want to address the issue of, foreign influence in universities, enforce reporting requirements for, foreign gifts and grants, and investigate noncompliance.
They're worried about China, aren't they?
Very much so.
What about the issue of, free speech on college campuses? Do they address that?
They do. They advocate for greater academic freedom and intellectual diversity on college campuses, pushing back against what they perceive as, a liberal bias in academia.
It's a hot-button issue for sure, and one that's sure to generate a lot of debate. But it's definitely a clear indication of their commitment to promoting, conservative values in education.
It is. And it's a vision that, would fundamentally reshape the U.S. education system. It remains to be seen how feasible it would actually be to implement, these really sweeping changes.
Yeah. A lot of people might say that this is all, pie in the sky, that
Yeah.
none of this would actually ever get implemented. What do you think? Is this vision for a second Trump administration realistic?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Hmm.
It really depends on a lot of things. The political climate, the composition of Congress, and the ability of a second Trump administration to, really mobilize public support for its agenda.
Well, there you have it, folks. We've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive into U.S. Policy Adjustment Expectations 2025. And it's a document that offers, well, a fascinating, if sometimes alarming, glimpse into what a potential second Trump administration might look like.
We've seen their vision for, a leaner, more ideologically driven government, a hard line on China, a return to traditional values, and that big focus on empowering, individuals and states.
But we're just getting started. In Part 2, we'll delve deeper into their specific proposals for the Department of Defense, including their plans for modernizing the military, enhancing missile defense, and confronting China's growing military might.
We'll also explore their vision for, U.S. agriculture, their approach to environmental policy, and their plans for the Department of Energy.
So stay tuned. We'll be back with Part 2 of our deep dive soon.
See you then. Welcome back to our deep dive into U.S. Policy Adjustment Expectations 2025.
Part 2.
Part 2, that's right. In Part 1, we went through, a whole bunch of potential policy shifts from immigration and trade to, healthcare and education.
We covered a lot of ground.
We did. But now we're going to focus on areas that are, arguably even more, consequential. Things like defense, agriculture, energy, and the environment.
The big stuff. Okay, so let's jump right in, shall we? We're starting with the Department of Defense. And it sounds like they have some pretty ambitious plans in store.
Oh, they do. The overarching theme here is definitely strength and preparedness. They want to make sure that the U.S. military stays, the dominant force in the world, capable of, deterring those adversaries like China and Russia, and of course, responding effectively to any threat that might come up.
It's all about peace through strength, then.
Exactly. Peace through strength. They argue that, weakness invites aggression, and they want to send a clear message that the U.S. is not afraid to, use its military might to protect its interests.
That does sound like a pretty hawkish stance. So what are some of the specific things they propose? Are we talking like more troops, new weapons systems?
All of the above, pretty much.
Yeah.
They call for a significant increase in defense spending, focusing on modernizing the nuclear arsenal, developing those new technologies like hypersonic weapons, and, expanding the U.S. military presence in key strategic locations around the world.
More troops, more weapons, more bases. It's a classic recipe for projecting power, isn't it?
It is. And they also want to see, greater burden sharing from U.S. allies. They're arguing that those allies need to contribute more to those collective defense efforts.
That's something we heard a lot about during the first Trump administration. It seems like they weren't satisfied with the level of commitment from, say, those NATO allies, particularly in Europe.
Right. They want to see those European countries, step up their defense spending and take a much more active role in countering, Russian aggression.
Okay. What about China? I mean, we know they see China as that primary strategic competitor. How do they propose to, deal with that challenge?
They advocate for what they call a denial defense strategy, which basically means making it, way too costly for China to actually achieve its military objectives. And they're really focused on, deterring China from any aggressive actions in the Taiwan Strait.
So sending a very clear signal to China, like, hey, any attempt to use force is going to be met with overwhelming resistance.
Exactly. And they also call for, strengthening those ties with U.S. allies in the Asia-Pacific region. Countries like, Japan, South Korea, Australia. The goal is to create a united front against, Chinese expansionism.
It sounds like that could lead to, some serious tension in the region. Do you think it could actually lead to, an actual conflict?
It's definitely a risky strategy. There's no doubt about that.
No.
But it's one that they believe is, absolutely necessary to maintain U.S. dominance in the Indo-Pacific.
Okay, so beyond, military hardware and alliances, are there any other parts of the Department of Defense they're looking to change?
Oh, yeah. They propose, for example, some pretty big reforms to the DoD's acquisition process, streamlining the bureaucracy, giving the military more, flexibility to acquire the technologies it needs. They're really focused on, those cutting-edge technologies, things like artificial intelligence, hypersonic weapons, cyber warfare capabilities.
So they're thinking about the future of warfare, right? Where it's, well, increasingly high-tech and reliant on those advanced weapons systems.
Exactly. They're thinking ahead. And they also want to, strengthen the U.S. defense industrial base.
Yeah.
Make sure that the U.S. has the capacity to, well, actually produce the weapons and equipment it needs, especially in a time of crisis.
It's like they're saying, we can't rely on other countries to supply us with the things we need to defend ourselves.
Exactly. Self-reliance again. They also want to improve, recruitment and retention in the military, addressing those systemic issues, making military service more attractive to young people.
That's a challenge, though, isn't it? I mean, all militaries face that, especially now with, declining birth rates and so much competition from the private sector.
Oh, absolutely. It's a tough one. And then they also call for, enhancing the military's intelligence capabilities, improving the quality and timeliness of, intelligence analysis, and restoring public trust in the intelligence community, which has taken some hits, let's be honest.
It has. It has. That last point is, really crucial, especially after all this controversy surrounding, intelligence failures in recent years.
Right. It's all about rebuilding that trust. And finally, they propose a significant investment in, missile defense, both at home and abroad, to protect the U.S. and its allies from those ballistic missile attacks, particularly from countries like North Korea and Iran.
So to sum it all up, a more muscular military, a tougher stance on China, and a renewed emphasis on missile defense. It's a pretty comprehensive and ambitious agenda for the Department of Defense. One that, really reflects a worldview that prioritizes military strength.
Yeah.
And a willingness to use force to achieve, U.S. objectives.
Right. It's a vision that would have, really far-reaching consequences for U.S. foreign policy, global security, the whole balance of power in the 21st century.
Big stuff. Okay, let's shift gears a bit now and take a look at their plans for, U.S. agriculture. What's their vision for the future of farming in America?
Well, they advocate for what they call a conservative approach to agriculture, one that, really emphasizes minimal government intervention and a real focus on market forces.
So less regulation, fewer subsidies, more freedom for farmers to, do their thing. Does that mean like getting rid of programs like crop insurance or price supports?
They definitely argue that the USDA has become, too bureaucratic and intrusive, and they want to streamline its operations, reduce its footprint in the agricultural sector.
Okay, so what are some of the specifics? Are they gonna get rid of the USDA altogether?
Not entirely.
Yeah.
But they want to, revise the USDA's mission statement to focus only on food production, and they want to eliminate what they consider, all those extraneous programs, things related to, climate change, equity, rural development.
So back to basics. Focus on, the core function of the USDA, which is, making sure there's a safe and abundant food supply for the country.
Right. Food first. They also want to, reform farm subsidies, reduce or even eliminate many programs that they believe, distort the market and create dependency.
That's going to be controversial, though, right? I mean, a lot of farmers rely on those subsidies to survive, especially, with those volatile commodity prices and the unpredictable weather patterns we've been seeing.
They do acknowledge that some safety nets are, necessary, especially for those unforeseen events, but they believe that the current system is, too generous and that it actually discourages, innovation and efficiency.
So a leaner, more market-oriented USDA.
Got it. What about, food assistance programs like SNAP and WIC? Do those fall under the USDA?
Right now they do. But they're proposing to transfer those food and nutrition programs, like SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and WIC, the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children, to the Department of Health and Human Services.
Whoa, that's a big change. So moving those programs out of, the agriculture realm and into the healthcare system.
Right, exactly. It's a move that really reflects their, bigger goal of shrinking the USDA and consolidating those social welfare programs under, HHS. It would definitely be a major shift in how those programs are, administered.
Yeah.
And it could potentially impact, well, millions of Americans who rely on those programs for food assistance.
No doubt about it. It would be a big change.
What about, those environmental programs within the USDA, like those conservation programs?
They want to reform those too.
Yeah.
Make sure that they're, really targeted and effective.
Right.
And eliminate those really broad programs, like the Conservation Reserve Program, which they view as, well, wasteful and ineffective.
The Conservation Reserve Program is the one that pays farmers to, take that environmentally sensitive land out of production, right? It sounds like they're, well, pretty skeptical of those kinds of government-led conservation efforts.
They are. It's a sign of their skepticism towards, environmental regulations in general, and their belief that market forces are, well, better suited to addressing those environmental concerns.
Okay, so a leaner USDA, a more market-driven approach to agriculture. What about, trade? How do they see the U.S. engaging in agricultural trade with the rest of the world?
They want to, promote those free trade policies, removing barriers to, agricultural exports and making sure that U.S. farmers have access to those global markets.
Right. They're saying that American agriculture is, the most competitive in the world, and they want to unleash its full potential.
Exactly. Open up those new markets for U.S. products.
It's a stance that's likely to be, welcomed by a lot of farmers, but it could also lead to, well, some trade disputes with other countries who feel threatened by, that U.S. agricultural dominance.
Yeah, it's a potential downside for sure.
It is. What else?
Well, they're also really big on, agricultural biotechnology, calling for the removal of those regulatory obstacles that they believe are, hindering innovation in areas like, well, genetic engineering.
So they see biotechnology as, a key to increasing food production and addressing those global food security challenges.
They do. And they also want to, reform the Forest Service, promote active management of forests, reduce those regulatory obstacles to fuel reduction efforts, to prevent those wildfires.
It sounds like they're not big fans of, a hands-off approach to forest management.
Not at all. They believe that, well, a more hands-on approach is needed and that environmental regulations, often do more harm than good.
Okay. Any other big changes they propose for the USDA?
One more. They want to either eliminate or reform the dietary guidelines for Americans. They view those guidelines as, well, too influenced by political considerations and not really based on, sound science.
Those are the guidelines that offer, recommendations for healthy eating.
Right. And they're basically saying that the government shouldn't be, involved in shaping those recommendations.
It's interesting. It's a move that's probably going to be welcomed by, the food industry, which has often been pretty critical of those dietary guidelines.
Oh, for sure.
Okay, so to recap, their vision for U.S. agriculture is one of, deregulation, free markets, and a real focus on, well, maximizing production and efficiency.
Exactly. It's an approach that's likely to be welcomed by, a lot of farmers and those big agribusinesses, but it also raises concerns about, the potential environmental and social consequences of such a dramatic policy shift.
It does. Okay, let's move on now to energy and the environment. What's their vision for, the future of energy production in the U.S.?
They advocate for what they call an all-of-the-above energy strategy, one that, embraces all sources of energy. We're talking fossil fuels, nuclear power, and those renewable energy sources like, well, solar and wind.
So it sounds like a more balanced approach than some might expect. They're not, just promoting those fossil fuels like some people might assume.
Not at all. They recognize, the importance of renewable energy, but they argue that it shouldn't come at the expense of, those traditional energy sources. Yeah. They believe that the U.S. needs, well, a diverse and reliable energy mix to ensure both its economic security and national security.
Okay, so they're not buying into this idea that we need to, rapidly transition away from fossil fuels.
Nope. They're arguing that fossil fuels will continue to play, a vital role in the U.S. economy for, well, decades to come. And they want to see continued investment in, domestic oil and gas production.
That's a stance that's probably going to be welcomed by the energy industry, but I'm guessing it's going to be, well, pretty heavily criticized by environmental groups.
Oh, absolutely. And they're also, big supporters of nuclear power, which they view as, a safe, clean, and reliable source of energy, one that can help, reduce U.S. dependence on those foreign energy sources.
That's interesting because, that's actually an area where there's growing, bipartisan support. More and more people are recognizing the potential of nuclear power to address, climate change and those energy security concerns.
Yeah, it's becoming more mainstream.
Yeah.
And they also call for, streamlining the permitting process for all those energy projects. They argue that, well, all those bureaucratic delays are really hindering the development of new energy sources and, of course, driving up costs for consumers.
Right. That's a common complaint from the energy industry. They're always saying that, environmental regulations are too burdensome and that they stifle innovation.
Exactly. And they also want to see, increased investment in energy infrastructure, things like pipelines, transmission lines, refineries, all of that, to ensure that energy can be transported efficiently and reliably to where it's needed.
It's an area that, often gets neglected because those infrastructure projects can be, well, really costly and politically challenging to, actually get done.
Oh, they are. But they're really essential for, ensuring a robust and resilient energy system.
Okay, so what about climate change? Where do they stand on that issue?
This is where things get, well, a little more controversial. They acknowledge that, climate change is happening, but they're pretty skeptical of, the scientific consensus on its causes and the severity of its impacts.
So they're not denying climate change outright, but they're, questioning the mainstream narrative.
Yeah. They're basically saying that the science isn't settled.
Yeah.
And that there's a lot of uncertainty about, the future trajectory of climate change. They're also concerned that, policies aimed at addressing climate change, things like, carbon taxes or regulations on greenhouse gas emissions, will actually harm the U.S. economy and, cost jobs.
So a cautious approach to climate change policy, one that, prioritizes economic growth and energy independence over those more drastic measures to reduce emissions.
Exactly. They believe that the U.S. should focus on, developing those new technologies and adapting to climate change rather than trying to prevent it altogether.
It's a stance that's likely to be, welcomed by some segments of the population, but it's also sure to be, pretty heavily criticized by environmental groups and, of course, those scientists who believe that, more urgent action is needed.
Oh, absolutely. There's going to be pushback. And they also want to see, the U.S. withdraw from those international climate agreements. Like, the Paris Agreement. They're arguing that those agreements are, unfair to the U.S. and that they won't actually be effective in addressing climate change.
That would be a really controversial move. And it would probably damage, U.S. relations with a lot of countries around the world.
No doubt. But it's a sign of their, America First approach to climate policy. They're prioritizing, U.S. interests over that global cooperation.
Okay. So to sum it all up, their energy and environment policy is all about, energy independence, economic growth, and that cautious approach to climate change.
Right. And it's likely to appeal to those who, really prioritize energy affordability and are, pretty skeptical of government intervention in the energy sector. But of course, it raises concerns about, those potential environmental consequences.
It does. It seems like there's a lot to think about here, and we still have, more ground to cover, including their plans for the Department of Energy.
We do, and we'll be diving into all of that in Part 3 of our Deep Dive.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. In Parts 1 and 2, we, journeyed through this potential second Trump administration's vision for America, everything from overhauling government agencies to, taking on those big global challenges. And now we're turning our attention to a department that plays a pretty critical role in shaping America's future, the Department of Energy.
Right, the DOE. And the document lays out, a very clear objective for them, ensuring, America's energy dominance. They want a department that prioritizes, American energy independence, promotes innovation, and, streamlines those regulations that they believe are holding back progress.
It sounds like they're aiming for, a full-blown energy revolution. But what does that actually look like? What are some of the, those key areas they're targeting?
Well, one of the big things they emphasize is this, this all-of-the-above energy strategy, which basically means supporting a mix of energy sources, including fossil fuels, nuclear power, and renewables. The goal is to create, a diverse and resilient energy portfolio.
So they're not, picking favorites when it comes to energy sources. They want it all. But wouldn't that make it, a lot harder to address climate change?
That's a good question. And while they do acknowledge that, climate change is happening, they're pretty skeptical about, the pace and severity of its impacts and, the effectiveness of some of those mitigation strategies.
So they're not, those outright climate change deniers, but they're definitely questioning the that prevailing narrative and the urgency of action.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. They're basically saying that, well, those really drastic measures to reduce emissions could actually harm the U.S. economy and unfairly impact those industries that, rely on fossil fuels.
So it sounds like they're, walking a tightrope here, trying to balance, energy independence and economic growth with those environmental concerns. How do they propose to square that circle?
Well, they put a lot of emphasis on, technological innovation. They want to see increased investment in, research and development, particularly in areas like, well, carbon capture and storage, advanced nuclear technologies, energy efficiency, things like that.
So instead of, focusing on reducing fossil fuel use, they want to find ways to make it, well, cleaner and more efficient.
Exactly. It's about, making those existing technologies work better.
Okay. What about, those renewable energy sources? Do they have any plans for those?
Well, they support, renewables as part of that diverse energy mix, but they don't really see them, replacing fossil fuels anytime soon. They believe that, if you rely too much on renewables, it could make the energy grid less reliable and, drive up those costs for consumers.
So a very, pro-business, pro-growth stance. But what about, those potential environmental consequences? I mean, are they just ignoring those?
They argue that, a strong economy is actually better equipped to protect the environment. They believe that, innovation, not regulation, is the best path to, well, a cleaner, more sustainable future.
That's a perspective we hear a lot from those who, they favor a less interventionist approach to, well, to environmental issues.
Right. Less government interference, more market-driven solutions.
Okay. What about America's, role in the global energy market? Do they have any specific plans there?
They definitely want to see America become, a dominant player in that global energy market. They call for, expanding U.S. energy exports, arguing that it would strengthen the economy, create jobs, and, reduce global dependence on energy from, let's say, less than friendly nations.
So it's not just about, energy independence at home, but also about, projecting American power and influence around the world.
Exactly. It's about leveraging, those vast energy resources to advance U.S. geopolitical interests and, well, kind of shape that global energy landscape to their advantage.
Well, folks, there you have it. We've taken a deep dive into U.S. Policy Adjustment Expectations 2025. And, we've explored this potential roadmap for a second Trump administration. It's a vision that's, well, it's bold, ambitious, and undeniably controversial. It touches on, pretty much every aspect of American life, from the structure of government to, well, to the nation's role in the world.
And we've seen, a really consistent theme throughout this entire document, this desire to, shrink the size and scope of the federal government, return power to those states, promote those traditional values, and project American strength on the world stage.
And whether you find, this vision exciting or alarming, one thing's for sure, it would be a significant departure from, the current political landscape. And it's something that all of us, regardless of, our political leanings, need to be aware of and, well, engage with.
Absolutely. And as you continue to explore these issues and engage in those, those really vital conversations that are shaping our future, it's so important to, approach them with an open mind, critical eye, and a willingness to, consider those diverse perspectives.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. And we encourage you to, continue your own exploration of these really important topics and to stay tuned for more, those curated insights on future episodes of The Deep Dive.
I'll be here.